Thank you so much for coming through this drizzly day, and welcome to the Brookings Institution. Why is this event occurring at the Brookings Institution, you may ask? Answer: for more than 20 years, within the Governance Studies program, of which I'm a member, we have had a religion and public life program that has engaged in a wide variety of activities. And so we at Governance Studies and at Brookings view this as a continuation of our mission. I'm remiss in my first duty. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Bill Galston, a senior fellow in Governance Studies here at Brookings. This project on religion and public life has been spearheaded for much of its existence by E.J. Dionne, who is not with us today because he's spending the semester teaching appropriately enough at the Harvard Divinity School. So you get me as second prize. We are thrilled to be hosting this event, which is sponsored by the American Charter Project. Some of you know something about this project, others not so much. Very briefly, and there are people around the room who can explain this at much greater length, the American Charter Project is an effort to return to first principles, to lift the discussion of religious liberty out of the morass of specific controversy in which it's now embroiled, and to remind Americans, all of us, regardless of partisanship, ideology, religious persuasion, or lack of same, about this incredibly important reservoir of principles that we have in common that has helped to constitute our country. And many historians and political philosophers believe that religious liberty was the grain of sand around which the pearl of liberal democracy formed. So this is no small topic. You know, this is an essential topic, and getting religious liberty right, reminding ourselves of the commonality that we have as citizens of the United States, incredibly fortunate to have the religious freedom and anti-establishment clauses of our Constitution, many people around the world, regardless of their critique of different aspects of the American experience, look with envy and longing on our ability to handle religious diversity peacefully. And our first principles have much to do with that. The American Charter Project will, before the end of the year, its backers and leaders fondly hope, release the American Charter of Religious Liberty. We hope to have a grand signing ceremony. We have outsized aspirations to get former presidents involved in the public exercise. Stay tuned, but we intend this to be as visible a restatement of the first principles of religious liberty as possible. We have a jam-packed program for you, which includes not only a keynote speaker, but also what I'm sure will be a spirited panel discussion. I will introduce the panelists when it comes time for the panel, but now it's not my duty, it's my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker, John DiIulio Jr. There are many people of whom it is said that when God made X, he subsequently broke the mold, but I have great confidence in introducing John in exactly that vein. He is one of a kind, a superstar academic, a committed participation in civil society institutions, and he has highly relevant experience in the White House. During his academic leave in 2001 and 2002, he served as the very first director of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives and has lived to tell the tale. And perhaps we'll find out about some of the scars. But in his subsequent life, He is the Frederick Fox Leadership Professor of Politics, Religion, and Civil Society at the University of Pennsylvania, the first in his family to attend college. And I'm glad he can make that claim legitimately. Not everybody can. Outside academic life, he's developed programs to mentor the children of prisoners, provide literacy training in low-income communities, reduce homicides in high-crime police districts, and support inner-city Catholic schools that serve low-income children. He's the author or co-author of over a dozen books and several hundred articles. Many of these books are landmark, including his textbook on American government, but some are outright miraculous. Let me give you an example. He wrote a book arguing that the American federal bureaucracy is much too small, and he got the Templeton Foundation to publish it. With that, Brother Diolio.
Wow, broke the mold, that's for sure, because they don't want anything too big coming out of those molds here. Well, thank you so very kindly, Bill, and I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to my old friend, Dr. Byron Johnson of Baylor University, and to the other chairs, co-chairs of the American Charter Project, my old friend, Dr. Jacqueline Rivers. She's here somewhere. There's Dr. Rivers. And also the eminent Oz Guinness. It's a special treat to be here at Brookings. On and off over the past 3 decades, some of my, it's been sort of a home away from home for me on a bunch of different topics: government reform, healthcare administration, and the topic that brings us together today, religion in the public square. As Bill alluded, starting back in the 90s and 2000s, really, Brookings birthed several major conferences and publications, including one White House organized event on church-state relations, faith-based initiatives, and the civic role of sacred places. One of those Brookings books, you didn't get Dion, but I'm going to give you a little Dion, just for good measure. One of those books was a volume co-edited by the great E.J. Dion and bringing up the rear me. And it was published in 2000, and it was entitled, "What's God Got to Do with the American Experiment?" And E.J. and I began the book with these words, quote, "One could imagine the question posed in the title of this book, What's God Got to Do with the American Experiment?, provoking 2 legions to mass against each other. They'd offer sharply different accounts of the role of God and organized religion in creating and nurturing the American experiment. In one view, it is America's pluralistic and secular constitution that has promoted freedom, diversity, and oddly, the very strength of America's religious communities. In the other account, freedom itself is rooted in a theistic, many would say Judeo-Christian, commitment to the inviolable dignity of the individual human being. This argument is as old as the Republic, and in truth, the 2 views are not mutually exclusive." Close quote. Well, today, some 17 years after those words were inked, we still, thank Providence or probability, we still have not witnessed 2 legions massing against each other at the civic intersection of religion and politics. Not yet, anyway. But there is simply no denying that, as is forthrightly stated in the flyer for today's event, bitter polarization along partisan, ideological, and religious lines seems to have become the norm in today's America, not least with respect to the public discourse regarding religious freedoms, church-state questions, and religious identities. Make no mistake, the concerns that motivate the American Charter Project are real. Just last week, Baylor University released a survey probing how Americans view each other, with a section focused on perceptions of atheists, conservative Christians, Jews, and Muslims. The results were well summarized by the headline on that survey that ran last week in the Washington Post. And I quote, "Evangelicals fear Muslims, atheists fear Christians. New poll shows how Americans mistrust one another." Yikes. And I probably should just leave it at yikes. But let me address the polarization challenge for you by offering 3 sets of observations. First, a puzzle, next a prescription, or two or three, and finally a prayer. The puzzle is how we got to this point. People feeling more rabid than reasonable about religion and a politics that turns religious or cultural differences into fodder for political divisions is absolutely nothing new, and we have in the past witnessed worse. For starters, think witch-burning, institutionalized anti-Semitism, and nativist anti-Catholicism. But the puzzle is that this is happening now in the early 21st century and in the wake of several developments of the last 15 to 20 years that might have been expected to make no discernible difference at all, or if anything, to cut the other way. For instance, Robert Putnam and David Campbell, in their remarkable 2010 opus, American Grace, How Religion Divides and Unites Us, and much other research as well, documents that since the mid-1960s, Americans' religious identities have actually become more fluid. Most adult Americans are more inclined than their parents or grandparents were to know, and even to marry, people of other faiths, and more likely to profess, as it were, that there is no one religious path to being a good citizen or a good person, and even no one religious path to passing through the pearly gates. By something of the same token, until fairly recently at least, most post-2000 national surveys probing Americans' attitudes on church-state issues painted a rather decidedly centrist picture. For instance, throughout the 2000s, about 2/3 to 3/4 of citizens supported government funding for faith-based organizations that supply social services, and about the same fraction agreed that religiously motivated social service providers tend to be caring, compassionate, and cost-effective. But that majority support for and positive sentiment toward funding faith-based organizations plummeted whenever the proposition extended to funding pervasively sectarian activities or permitting carte blanche accommodations to hire only co-religionists. The centrist and moderate public opinion on religion in the public square was echoed in this period by courts of law, most particularly, I would say, in the Supreme Court's neutrality doctrine approach to interpreting and applying the First Amendment's two religion clauses. Politicians joined judges in following the election returns. For all the controversies that surrounded and hounded the so-called federal charitable choice laws that were first enacted in the 1990s, 3 successive presidential administrations, 2 8-year Democrats sandwiching 1 8-year Republican, each partially defied its electoral base and supported faith-based and community initiatives or neighborhood partnerships. Now, we must always, of course, expect the politically unexpected, but how lukewarm bipartisanship gave way to red-hot conflict is, I think, truly a puzzle. And I have some answers begat by my reading of the latest social science research that is relevant to the subject, but since social science is the elaborate demonstration of the obvious by methods that are obscure, I will spare you unless you dare to ask later on. As for my prescription, I confess before committing the sin that it is one that only an old American government professor could love. Namely, taming polarization and stoking civility by preaching and practicing 3 lessons about religion in the public square bequeathed to us by James Madison. Lesson number 1 is that what Madison in Federalist Paper number 10 termed a zeal for different opinions concerning religion feeds dangerous political factions. No faith is beyond faction, and religious pluralism isn't just what nice, broad-minded people are supposed to profess. Rather, religious pluralism is essential to containing, if not curing, the mischiefs of religiously fueled factions. As Madison wrote in Federalist Paper number 51, and I quote, "In a free government, the security for civil rights must be the same as for religious rights. It consists in the one case in the multiplicity of interests, and in the other in the multiplicity of sects." Now, I once gave a midterm exam about Madison's views on religious pluralism, and one student wrote, and I quote, "Madison says the way to protect religious rights is for Americans to have lots and lots of sex, S-E-X." That was worth half credit. The second lesson is that religion can be a tremendously and uniquely powerful civic tonic and a tremendously and uniquely powerful civic toxin. And both with respect to religion as a broad socio-political force and with respect to religion as manifest in a particular religious denomination or network or organization, it can be both a civic tonic and a civic toxin at one and the same time. EJ and I, in the aforementioned Brookings volume, probably owed Madison royalties when we concluded our introductory chapter as follows, and I quote, "Religious faith can create community, and it can divide communities. It can lead to searing self-criticism, and it can promote a pompous self-satisfaction. It can encourage dissent and conformity, generosity and narrow-mindedness. Its very best and very worst forms can be inward-looking. Religion's finest hours have been times when intense belief led to social transformation, yet some of its darkest days have entailed the translation of intense belief into the ruthless imposition of orthodoxy." Permit me to personalize this point just a bit. I happen to be a Roman Catholic, a big one. And I am so by cradle and by choice. More precisely, if more confusingly, I am probably best described as a born-again Catholic in the Jesuit tradition. My belief in and love for Jesus Christ is not simply my religious identity. It infuses every aspect of my life, on a good day, when I'm behaving myself at least. And as I wrote about in the 2007 book, Godly Republic, many of those who were most important to my own early midlife faith journey were not in fact Catholic, but were of other religions and other religious Christian denominations as well, including the great Philadelphia Pentecostal preacher, the late great Benjamin Pop Smith. But I do have a special love and affinity for the nuns, Catholic nuns who helped to raise and, holding them blameless, helped to educate me. Now that's nuns, N-U-N-S, not nuns, N-O-N-E-S, as in the Pew surveys showing the rapid post-2007 growth in the number of adults in the U.S., about a quarter of the population now, who self-identify as atheists or agnostics, or who say their religion is, quote, nothing in particular. I'd be perfectly happy, by the way, if 25% of all Americans were Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, but I'll leave that off to the side. But to be serious, the civic tonic, civic toxin reality is well illustrated by my own church. For example, last year in 2016, the Penn Program for Research on Religion and Civil Society released a report documenting how the Philadelphia Catholic Church's contribution to the region's economy totals about $4.2 billion annually, which is greater than the city of Philadelphia government's $4 billion annual general fund. And the church's contributions there are concentrated in services to low-income children, youth, and families, programs to help the infirm elderly, the dying, and others in need, people of all faiths, people of no faith. The Archdiocese Summer Food and Nutrition Program, all by itself, is a miracle of care and compassion. So that was 2016, but a year earlier, 2015, the same research center hosted a conference on the 10th anniversary of the grand jury report on child sex abuse in the Archdiocese. It is hard to fathom how the selfsame religious body that has done and continues to do so much that is so very good could also enable so much that is so very bad. But thus it is, and there is no blinking at either reality. In part because religion has been recognized as both a uniquely powerful civic tonic and civic toxin, the Supreme Court has, rightly in my view, effectively singled religion out from philosophy, out from other belief systems and other non-religious isms for both special benefits and special burdens. By the same token, debates over issues like Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, or RFRAs, are, or I would argue ought to be, at least somewhat agonizing for each person engaged in them, because the very same rights and accommodations that can be essential to personal freedom of conscience, to institutional religious freedom, to good works that benefit people of all faiths and of no faith, the very same rights and accommodations that equip and empower religious institutions to generate such significant social and economic halo effects can also sometimes be used not merely to duly exempt religious believers from public laws and regulations to which they would otherwise be bound, but to dangerously privilege certain beliefs and discriminatory practices while shielding individuals and institutions from being held accountable or, as in the child sex abuse cases, from ever being brought to justice. My friend Bill Galston here is an expert on so many things, including the thought of the late, great Sir Isaiah. I never said Isaiah or Isaiah. Isaiah Berlin. And as Bill will know, one of Berlin's favorite borrowed sayings was, "Freedom for the pike is death for the minnow." Berlin was ever at pains to caution against what he termed, quote, "the ancient doctrine according to which all truly good things are linked to one another in a single perfect whole, or at the very least cannot be incompatible with one another," close quote. Well, the point to remember here is that Orthodox religion, Orthodox sectarianism, is no more or less inevitably or invariably anti-pluralist than Orthodox secularism is or can be. Indeed, a healthy to heavenly respect for the fact that we cannot have it all, that we must make morally challenging choices and trade-offs, and that life on this earth is full of mysteries, as in truths that no one can fully understand. This is at the very heart, the theological core of many great religions. And indeed, that would include my own, such that even St. Mother Teresa could doubt. Hence it is that the third lesson, one derived more from certain parts of Madison's friendship life than from any words he wrote, might be the most timely and important. Let me preface this lesson by making sort of a blunt assertion. Pragmatically speaking, to be a good citizen in a demographically diverse democratic republic does not require civic nobility, but it does preclude civic narcissism. I may be a Catholic of a particular stripe, very strange stripe perhaps, but there are Catholics of many other types, and not only Catholics, but Quakers, Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, Baptists, Buddhists, Methodists, Muslims, Mormons, Anglicans, atheists, agnostics, Presbyterians, pagans, Pentecostals, New Agers, nuns, both types, and scores more. What we need is to entertain as sympathetically as possible ideas and values related to different religious traditions, including different non-religious traditions, and most particularly to entertain ideas and values on issues of religious freedom and church-state relations that one is, for whatever reasons, strongly inclined to reject outright as wrong-headed, wrong-hearted, not mine. So back to Madison. Consider two leaders whom Madison knew well and respected lots, but who had quite distinct views on religion's civic role. On one arm, Madison had his Maine College of New Jersey mentor, the Reverend John Witherspoon, a Scotch Presbyterian minister whom Madison affectionately called the Old Doctor. Witherspoon tutored Madison to believe that there was no way that a free republic could survive without Orthodox religion, and not just Orthodox religion, but in particular Orthodox Christianity, and that civil magistrates should be all cut from Christian cloth and be empowered to, quote, punish impiety, close quote. But on his other arm, Madison had his friend, mentor, and fellow Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, whose own religious views, of course, tended a little closer to deism. Jefferson's perspective on religion in the public square was one that the Old Doctor never could countenance. And in the end, Madison sided more closely with Jefferson, but he appreciated and he respected and he never lost sight of the value of the ideas, the beliefs, the heart of his old friend, the Old Doctor, Reverend Witherspoon. Now, historical footnote, Madison did get fed up with Patrick Henry and his brand of religious conservative, but that's another story for another conference. Let me conclude then, in preface to my concluding prayer, let me conclude with three terribly, terribly homely suggestions. First, recognize that many 20th and early 21st century political leaders in each party have been mostly, if not always or entirely, reasonable, well-informed, and well-balanced in their views on religion in the public square. We don't have to romanticize this recent history to believe this, but I think it's very important at this time to just recall it. For instance, harken back to the 2000 presidential contest. In May 1999, Vice President Al Gore spoke about how America's, quote, severest problems and challenges are not just material, but spiritual. I believe strongly, he said, in the separation of church and state, but freedom of religion need not mean freedom from religion. 2 months later, July 1999, then Governor George W. Bush spoke about America's armies of compassion. We will, he said, keep a commitment to pluralism, not discriminating for or against Methodists or Mormons or Muslims or good people of no faith at all. Government cannot be replaced by charities, but it must welcome them as partners, not resent them as rivals. Pretty good stuff. Seems like a long time ago. Second, let's try to be as fact-based about faith-based matters as we reasonably and feasibly can be, and let's also try to be open ourselves to hearing each other and hearing each other out on each or all sides of given religious freedom and church-state issues. For instance, two colleagues of mine, Professor Marcy Hamilton and Dr. Stanley Carlson Tees, together head a project called Common Ground for Common Good under the auspices of the aforementioned Penn Religion Research Program. Read Marcy Hamilton's 2014 book, it's in its second edition, God versus the Gavel. Read Stan's book, co-authored with the late, great Dr. Stephen Mansma, Free to Serve. If you read God versus the Gavel with an open mind, back to back with Free to Serve, you will get intellectual whiplash. And if you read them back to back with an open mind, you might or might not change how you think or feel about the issues and values at stake. But I think you'll surely understand your own empirical and ethical historical premises a lot better, and you will quite possibly see the other side or sides of given religious freedom and church-state issues a tad more empathetically than you did before. We don't know how to produce empathy. We know how to change behavior at the margins in some conditions. We don't know how to produce empathy. Empathy is a precious thing. Once lost, could be gone from a society forever. We need more of that. And this may be just one, again, very homely way forward. Third, I would say let's celebrate a little. It's been a very dour, sad. Let's celebrate a little bit. Let's celebrate how in a demographically dynamic and diverse representative democracy like ours, the civic intersections of religion and politics, the civic lanes that merge into church-state debates, are bound to be, and ought to be, busy and boisterous, not calm and quiet. Honking horns, traffic jams, indelicate disputes about who has the right of way, occasional confusion about the rules of the road, and accidental fender benders. But let's also at the same time insist, emphatically, unambiguously, non-negotiable, that one and all always stop far short of the civic equivalent of road rage. There are lines that cannot be crossed and should not be crossed. In his book, The Audacity of Hope, published in 2006, then Senator Barack Obama described religion in the Senate as follows, quote, "Discussions of faith are rarely heavy-handed within the confines of the Senate. No one is quizzed on his or her religious affiliation. The Wednesday morning prayer breakfast is entirely optional, bipartisan, and ecumenical, and the sincerity, openness, humility, and good humor with which even the most overtly religious senators share their personal faith stories can sometimes be a ballast against the buffeting words of today's headlines and political expediency." Close quote. So my prayer is that sincerity, openness, humility, and good humor return not only to the U.S. Senate, but to the wider society. That we find ways to cauterize, if not contain, to rein in, if not to reverse, the polarization, and that the American Charter Project and kindred efforts are blessed to make a positive and lasting difference. So let me just stop there, take some questions. Thank you. God bless you. right, the floor is open, and we have a couple of folks. And when you ask a question, please just identify yourself, and if you can, ask a question. One that takes fewer than 7 volumes to catalog. Thank you. Questions? There's one up here, and I know it's going to be a doozy. So I know this fellow, I think. Pat, how are you?
Pat Fagan, now at Catholic University. A key question seems to me the intersection between morals, and particularly sexual morals, and religious freedom. And morals are not just individual, because by their very nature, they're of the relationship between one and another, and then spill over into community, the community one makes. Are you tackling, or will you tackle this, I think, naughtiest of all the naughty issues within religious freedom?
Well, if you say, will I, do you mean will the American Charter Project? Byron, you might want to speak to that. You know, you're pretty naughty. What do you? Not as naughty as I am, but let's just leave this off to the side for now. I mean, you never know it. You know, in Washington, anything, right? Sure, anything can happen.
Thanks, John, for putting me on the spot like that.
Yes, been doing it for years.
Yeah, these are issues, Pat, that we do think have to be discussed. You know, the American Charter Project, of course, has a goal of bringing civility back to these discussions. And we think it's necessary that people of all faith traditions or no faith traditions be able to have positions that we agree to disagree. This is what we think democracy is all about. So yeah, we think this project is important because it lays the foundation for discussions that we hope we can have on issues like this, the thorniest of these issues. And you know, a little bit later this year, John, we hope to roll out the charter and at a major public event. And then this would just be the beginning of a dialogue that would take on those kinds of issues.
Be good. And Pat, I would just, I'm sorry, it's Dr. Byron Johnson of Baylor University. Let me just say, Pat, just quickly to append a few words to Byron's response. Before the event began, we were together with the panelists talking a bit, and I mentioned I'm on the board of the Penn Hillel at Penn. I'm a non-Jew on the board of the Penn Hillel, and I actually, my beat is really very much with the Orthodox Jewish students. And one point in the last couple of years trailed onto these discussions. It happens over kosher food all the time, trail onto these discussions. And it was like, what do Catholics believe about sex? So I said, well, how serious do you, and these are very serious, scholarly young people, and I said, well, Pope John Paul II wrote this amazing stuff on theology of the body. And they read that and they're like, no, that's not what we had in mind. And it's an interesting question to look at each of the different religious, to look at each of the different religious traditions, because when you do, at least what I've discovered is, what I thought they taught is not necessarily what they do teach, and the variety of opinions and emphases and accents, even within the Catholic tradition, maybe even especially within the Catholic tradition, turns out to be a bit more variegated than one might suppose. All right, hands are going up everywhere. It's right down here. I'm going to go there, and I'm going to go this way. And if I don't balance it out, you'll take care. Right here, this gentleman wearing a very nice suit.
Don't start, John. Quick question. Next year is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. One of the things that's always been very striking to me in the discussion of religious freedom is how infrequently King is invoked as a voice for religious pluralism, religious tolerance, and freedom. In what ways, intelligently, could the 50th anniversary of King, or just Martin Luther King in general, be used as a counter-narrative to a lot of the toxic craziness? On a couple, because King has a commitment to the poor, his idea of freedom is freedom to serve. In what ways could this anniversary be used to try to tone down some of the really sectarian nuttiness and reintroduce a figure which amazingly has not been used at all by anybody, for the most part, in these discussions of religious freedom.
Thank you, Reverend Eugene F. Rivers III. Thank you, Reverend Rivers. So Bill mentioned that I wrote a book a year or two ago. It was supported and published by the Templeton Foundation, arguing that we need to hire 1 million more federal bureaucrats. So memo to any foundations out there, you know, somebody ought to go and publish 300 million copies of Letter from a Birmingham Jail and send them out. That could have two possible effects, right? I mean, or even short of 300. We'll take 100 million if anyone wants to pass that. Number one, the role, I mean, we talk about it all the time, and it's sometimes, you know, invoked, you know, hey, religion has had a major role. You can't understand major social movements in America, abolition movement, civil rights movement, you know, et cetera, without understanding the role of religion. We say that, and most of you in this room know that, because you're old. No. But it's not being taught. The role of religion in these social movements and these important transformational movements is not as well understood by millennials as one might hope or think it would be. So just reconnecting Dr. King's religiosity, the fact that he was a religious leader, and that he drew not only inspiration from his faith, but that's defined him itself is an important thing, and also, of course, his very message, which, of course, is transcendent. All right, I'm going to come back over here. Yes, right behind you, way back there. Take your pick. We can draw straws, or all right.
Hey, thanks, Tim Rideout. I guess you could call me agnostic yet spiritual. I'm wondering about how we have the really tough discussions, because you were saying, you know, what happened since '99, and obviously there is sort of the question of war. And I was lucky enough to edit this chapter by Jack Miles, who I believe he's out at UC Irvine, maybe, and it's I think he's Catholic in the Jesuit tradition. He was basically saying we have to find a way to talk about the geopolitics when there is mass religious strife, whether it's going back to the Reformation in Christianity or what's happening in the Persian and Arab worlds now. But how do we do it respectfully and in a way that doesn't, because I think part of what happened in this election is people conflate a group like ISIS with Islam as a whole, and then that leads to this cycle of increasingly intense targeting. And, you know, a lot of people are trying to fight against this and have spoken out, but it's almost like we've lost control of it. So how do we disaggregate these things in a respectful way?
Yeah, I wish I knew the answers to, you know, such questions and related questions, but here's what I would say to you. I've been at the University of Pennsylvania for a number of years, and at Penn, it's not a religious organization. In fact, it was the first non-sectarian, really, university in the country. But we do have a saint, and his name is Benjamin Franklin. So I refer to it as St. Ben's. And at St. Ben's, Franklin, not to Penn, but to the Library Company of Philadelphia in 1742-43, gave them a motto. And the motto, which I will not try to pretend that I know the Latin, even though I was an altar boy post-Vatican II, no Latin. It translates into, to pour forth benefits for the common good is divine. To pour forth, you know, Franklin didn't care whether you were an atheist, a Quaker, a Catholic, a Jew, whatever. He gave money to everybody in Philadelphia if he thought they were doing things that were good, if he thought they were doing things that had civic benefits. So you go global. Let's ask what people do. You shall know them by their works. Let's look at what different groups are doing on global poverty. There's been tremendous progress against global poverty, extreme global poverty, you know, which is, you know, measured pretty, you know, $2 US a day, you know. So by that measure, there's been great progress. By a more reasonable standard, maybe the progress hasn't been so great. What are the global faith communities? What are the international faith? What are the transnational religious organizations doing to assist with global poverty? The questions to ask first are about what people do, not what they say, how they behave, not what they preach necessarily. Many times, the behavior is better, you know, than the preaching, and sometimes it's not. So, and having gotten involved over the last few years in some global projects myself, in particular in China, there's a whole other dimension to this, which is if I told you that today in, yes, China, you can look at it in lots of different ways, but there is both a kind of a push and a pull in the role of religious organizations, even working with government to do things in the space of elder care, space of left behind children in rural areas, and so on. So, I mean, proceed inductively, right? And then ask the big questions. That's the way, I mean, that may not be a satisfying answer, but that's the way I would approach it. We're done, folks. I just got the thing. So thank you very much. Bless you.